sit here and you attack the president, and I am not going to have it. I'm not going to put up with it. You know, all they want to do, all the American people need to know this, because Donald Trump, the Dow right now is over. The Dow is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing. You're a great stock trader.
As the world changes and best friends they become strangers, watching for the danger, just go and get your paper. As the world changes and best friends they become strangers, watching for the danger, just go and get your paper. Alright, we tuning back into NaNTV, baby. You know what it is. We getting this hot black coffee in there, baby. You know what it is, man. We about to tell y'all today. Our subject for today is the transatlantic slave trade. It's going to be a touchy situation today. We're going to talk about migration patterns of sharks and systemic racism that still goes on today in our own society. So y'all stay tuned. Get ready. We're bringing you the real from the coldest place on earth. NaNTV, baby. You know what it is.
As white Europeans settled in North America in the 16th and 17th centuries, and millions of indigenous people died from famine and disease, the desire to profit from the natural resources available required exploitation of a new large and unpaid labor force. Extending the mass enslavement of Africans in Central and South America, Africans were brought to the United States in 1619 as a new source of labor. New England colonies were founded on ideals of liberty and freedom, but nonetheless embraced kidnapping, human bondage, and violent subjugation of black people, whose forced labor, trafficking, and enslavement fueled booming commerce like shipbuilding, manufacturing, insurance, and banking. Northern cities like New York City experienced massive commercial growth as their economies, like those based on Wall Street, were financed by the slave trade, and their streets, like Broadway, were built by enslaved people. Boston Harbor, the site of the Boston Tea Party, where protests for freedom sparked the American Revolution, was also a bustling commercial hub for human trafficking. Ships entering and leaving the port of Boston trafficked at least 27,000 kidnapped Africans. The trafficking and enslavement of kidnapped Africans funded the economy of every major port city on the eastern seaboard. As the enslavement of black people expanded, American slavery became a permanent generational status tied to race. A new, elaborate set of beliefs was created to codify, control, and subordinate black people. States and municipalities passed laws formally rejecting the presence of free black people in their borders. Punitive laws were enacted targeting black people, both free and enslaved. The false idea that black people were inferior to white people, not fully human or evolved, dominated all areas of American life. This narrative allowed the United States Constitution to extol liberty and justice for all, while denying millions of black people basic human rights. By the end of the 18th century, America was no longer a society with enslaved people. It had become a slave society. A shifting economic landscape and a growing outcry about the horrors of the Middle Passage finally led Congress to formally abolish the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. However, slavery remained critical to an agrarian economy, especially in the developing South. The domestic slave trade emerged while trafficking of kidnapped Africans continued illegally for years. The transatlantic slave trade left a lasting mark on American life, and the narratives that emerged to support the trade set up central problems of racial hierarchy that continue to shape America today.
All right, we tune back into NaNTV. I got this hot, fresh black coffee kicking in, baby. All right. Our subject for today gonna be the transatlantic slave trade. How 7 different countries were involved in these atrocities. You know, nobody's innocent in this factor.
But what we're going to prove to you today is some people took more advantage of this situation and also still use those tactics today to keep your mind, body, and soul in the slavery system. So we're going to get into it today. You know, when I start to show off, I like to pull off some fun facts first. So we're going to get to the first one. It's what I pulled up off Wikipedia. You know what it is. Wikipedia. All right. The transatlantic slave trade was a 400-year, 16th to 19th century maritime system that forcibly trafficked an estimated 12 to 12.8 million Africans to the Americas. Driven by and just to let y'all know, that number is not actually accurate. There were probably a whole lot more, but they downsized it or whatever. Driven by European demand for plantation labor, sugar, coffee, cotton, the trade devastated African societies, fueled European economic growth, and formed a deadly triangular trade route. Key aspects of the transatlantic slave trade. Main causes. The primary driver was the massive demand for labor in the Americas, particularly following the rapid decline of indigenous populations due to disease. So they needed to bring in slave labor because they were using the indigenous people, the Indians, as slaves first. Get that fact straight. They turned us into slaves. But being that we couldn't handle their diseases, we were dying off, you know, from smallpox, whatever nasty diseases they brought over with them. Our bodies and DNA wasn't ready to be immune to those yet. So they needed new slaves. So they said, let's get these black slaves and bring them over here. European nations sought to maximize profits from plantation agriculture, requiring a large enslaved workforce. They needed a large workforce. The triangular trade routes, this system connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Outward passage. European ships brought goods, firearms, textiles, alcohol to Africa to exchange for captives. So this is how they, you know, I know that a lot of African tribes are the ones that sold off some of these black people as slaves, but black people are very tribal. So if you have, you know, we've been warring with each other for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And the only way you could take out a tribe, if you could take out a tribe by having some white people take him, and you ain't got to deal with them, and they're going to give you firearms, textiles, and alcohol. Oh, yeah, that's like, you know, come on. That's a no-brainer. They were seduced by what the people were going to give them for these people to be their slaves. Okay. Outward passage. European ships brought. Middle passage. Captives were shipped across the Atlantic in brutal conditions, with roughly 12 million surviving the journey. So earlier they said it was what? 12.8 million that were brought over, but now they say 10.7 and 12 million surviving the journey. I don't believe in that number. But anyway, homeward passage. Ships returned to Europe with plantation products produced by slave labor. And remember, everybody, don't believe everything you read. Sometimes you need to go do your research on stuff and not just believe the first thing that you hear. Never believe what you see and only half of what you hear. Do your research. Okay? Major trading nations. Portugal and Britain, two #1 suspects, were the dominant traders, followed by France, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States. Ooh, big team they had going on. Man, we were some good friends back in the day, weren't we? We were some real good friends with these countries. Impact on Africa. The trade caused significant demographic, social, and economic disruption, including increased inter-tribal warfare, fueled by the demand for captives to exchange for European goods. So the Europeans came in with these firearms, alcohol, textiles, probably some white women, and seduced the African chiefs. They was like, "Ooh, I gotta get me some of that." You know, they got that stuff. You know, so you know how this is all manipulation tactics used for them to get these slaves. Interesting, very interesting. And then after they was doing this, it caused inner tribal warfare, fueled by the demand for captives to exchange for European goods. I'll agree with that. Now, increasing humanitarian pressure, slaves' resistance, and changing economic systems led to the abolition of the trade in the early 19th century. Britain outlawed the trade in 1807 and the U.S. in 1808. So Britain stepped up first. They was like, "Hold up, man. I don't think we should be doing this." But they had been doing it a long time already with the Irish and Scottish, you know, so they enslaved their own people. What makes you think they wouldn't want to go enslave somebody else?
There has been an ongoing debate as to whether the Irish were the first slaves in the Americas, predating the first black African slaves by almost a decade. Slavery is perhaps one of the oldest profit-making endeavors in human history, and the Irish were a special target for 1,000 years.
Throughout history, the Irish were persecuted by one faction or another, to include enslavement and indentured servitude. When did the Irish first become slaves? How long did the selling of the Irish continue? Who was responsible? Some groups deny the Irish slavery under English and later British rule, claiming that this was nothing more than voluntary indentured servitude, which did exist. However, there are counter-arguments that will be challenged here. There is a legitimate dispute as to the numbers enslaved, especially during the 17th century before the Act of Union in 1707. The official British legal terminology used was indentured servants. Whether the servants in question had willingly signed the indenture contract to emigrate to the Americas or were first to go. Many were forced. Therefore, those transported unwillingly and effectively sold were not considered to be indentured. This included political prisoners, vagrants, convicts, political activists, thieves, prostitutes, or people who had been defined as undesirable by the English government. The Irish introduction to slavery was during the first Viking raids in the year 795, lasting through the mid-9th century. This period saw the Irish killed and enslaved. Just like many other societies, the Vikings attacked. Most of these early raids were along the northern and eastern coast using hit-and-run tactics. The Vikings would then flee with treasure and slaves and return to either their holdings in Scotland or back to Norway. Usually, many slaves who were of value were ransomed back to their families, but others remained in captivity.
I am William Wallace, and I see a whole army of my countrymen here in defiance of tyranny. You've come to fight as free men, and free men you are. What will you do without freedom? Will you fight? Fight against that? No! We will run, and we will live. Aye. Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Global economic impact. Profits from the slave trade and slave-grown products provided essential capital for the Western Europe's economic development. Detailed records and data on the trafficking of over 12 million Africans can be found in the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. They got a database for it. It's pretty interesting, man. You know what I'm saying? So this started a whole, this is, you know, a whole bunch of stuff. You had so many countries involved in this. You had Portuguese, Spain, Britain, France, United States, the many African nations that were willing to give up captives for these beautiful goods that were going to be offered to them. You know, who's going to pass up on a musket firearm that you've never seen before, or pass up on a good tasting liquor that'll get you all happy and feeling like you could take over the world, you know, and textiles, you know, all kind of different technology they was bringing them, showing them and trading them stuff so they could take these black people over to America, whoop them, and make them pick cotton and do all the hard work. But also, you know, another fact that I pulled up was about the shark migrations in the Atlantic Ocean. We're gonna take a quick break. I'm gonna pop up this video for you so you can see what our next subject's gonna be about. It's gonna be about the shark migrations in the Atlantic Ocean. Stay tuned, baby. NaNTV. You know what it is.
In 1781, the slave ship Zong threw more than 130 enslaved Africans overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. Alive, shackled, the captain claimed it was to save water rations. But there was another reason, a calculated one: the enslaved were insured as cargo. Dead Africans lost overboard could be claimed for insurance money. What the crew of the Zong didn't record in their blood-stained ledgers was what happened next, below the surface. Because the ocean was watching, and the ocean was learning. Today we're diving into one of the most disturbing intersections of human cruelty and animal behavior in recorded history. This is a story that connects the unspeakable horrors of the Middle Passage with modern marine biology. And I warn you, this one will stay with you. Let's start with scale. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced onto ships destined for the Americas. These voyages, known as the Middle Passage, typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks across the Atlantic. But here's the number that matters for our story. Roughly 1.8 million people, nearly 15%, died during these crossings. Where did those bodies go? They were thrown overboard, sometimes after death from disease, starvation, or the horrific conditions below deck. Sometimes while still alive, if they were sick, if they resisted, or simply because a captain decided, like on the Zong, that the insurance mathematics worked better with corpses than with living, unsellable human beings. For nearly 400 years, these ships created what marine biologists now call predictable carrion corridors, regular routes where massive amounts of human remains entered the ocean with systematic consistency. And apex predators notice patterns. Now, before you think I'm anthropomorphizing sharks, let's talk science. Sharks, particularly species like tiger sharks, bull sharks, and oceanic whitetips, have something remarkable: spatial memory and learned behavior. Studies from the University of Miami and the Shark Research Institute have shown that sharks can remember feeding locations for up to a year or more. They pass through regions in seasonal patterns, but they also develop learned routes based on food availability. Think of it like this: if you discovered your favorite restaurant had a buffet every Tuesday for 4 centuries, you'd probably start showing up on Tuesdays. Sharks operate on similar principles, just with a much darker menu. The slave ships didn't follow random paths. They used established trade wind routes, from West Africa to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean to the American South, and then back to Europe. The same routes, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. So where's the proof? Let me show you 3 interconnected pieces of evidence that historians and marine biologists have been quietly discussing for the past 2 decades. First, historical accounts. Ship logs and survivor testimonies consistently mention sharks. Olaudah Equiano, an enslaved African who wrote one of the most important slave narratives in 1789, described sharks following the ships, visible from the deck. Ship's doctors and captains recorded large numbers of sharks trailing vessels. One account from 1788 describes sharks as constant companions of the slavers. These weren't occasional sightings. They were consistent observations across different ships, different routes, different decades. Second, migration pattern analysis. Modern shark tagging studies have revealed something fascinating. Certain shark populations, particularly tiger sharks and bull sharks in the Atlantic, follow migration routes that closely overlap with historical slave trade routes. A 2016 study tracking tiger sharks between West Africa and the Caribbean found they concentrated along the traditional Middle Passage shipping lanes, even though these routes don't align with typical prey patterns like seal colonies or seasonal fish migrations. Third, genetic clustering. Here's where it gets really interesting. Genetic analysis of shark populations shows unexpected mixing between West African and Caribbean shark populations during the period corresponding to the slave trade. Sharks that should have remained in more localized regions show evidence of transatlantic movement during this specific historical window. So how exactly does this work? How does tragedy create a migration route? Imagine you're an apex predator in the 1700s Atlantic. Suddenly, along specific corridors at specific times of year, corresponding to harvest seasons when slave ships departed Africa most frequently, there's an unprecedented, reliable food source. Sharks would begin to associate these routes and timings with feeding opportunities. Young sharks would learn from older sharks. Pregnant females would pass through these areas, and their offspring would imprint on these routes. Over generations spanning centuries, what began as opportunistic feeding became encoded behavior. The routes became highways in shark cognition, not through genetic hardwiring, but through cultural transmission, the same way orcas pass down hunting techniques or dolphins teach their young to use sponges as tools. The slave ships were essentially running a 400-year conditioning experiment on apex predators. Now here's where this story becomes a ghost tale. The transatlantic slave trade officially ended in the 1860s. Yet decades later, even into the early 20th century, sailors and fishermen continued to report unusual concentrations of sharks along the old routes. Some shark populations maintained migration patterns along these corridors well into the 1900s, long after the ships had stopped running. Think about that. Sharks were still following routes created by human atrocity, decades after the atrocity had ended. The ocean held memory in the behavior of its apex predators. It's as if the sharks themselves became witnesses, their migration patterns a living map of one of humanity's greatest crimes. Today, modern shipping, climate change, and overfishing have disrupted these old patterns. But the historical record remains in ship logs, in survivor testimonies, in genetic data, and in the behavioral patterns that took generations to fade. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The consequences of human cruelty don't end when the cruelty does. They ripple outward in ways we can't always predict, affecting ecosystems, animal behavior, and the very fabric of the natural world. The sharks didn't create the Middle Passage. They didn't fill the ships or throw bodies overboard. But their behavior changed because of it, a biological echo of human evil, swimming through the Atlantic for centuries.
Talking about these shark migrations in the Atlantic Ocean are different than the Pacific, because in the Pacific, it's a very big ocean, leads down into the Indian Ocean, a lot of abundance of food in there, but Atlantic Ocean, those sharks follow those slave ships. I pulled up some more fun facts that we could check out before we pop on the next video and get to the discussion. So this is what I pulled up. The transatlantic slave trade altered Atlantic shark behavior. As sharks learned to follow slave ships, relying on the high volume of dead bodies thrown overboard during the Middle Passage. Because, let's say the slave ship take off from Africa and something happened on the ship. You got disease, you got not enough food, you got rodent infestation maybe. You got all these problems, disease, you got to throw these people overboard. So these sharks learned that soon as that ship leave the port of Africa, heading over towards the Caribbean and up to the United States or South America, wherever, because that's where the destinations they were going, those sharks would follow the ship and wait for them to throw them a snack. That's what, in a shark's mind, hey, we ain't got to go look for no fish. It's going to come off that boat. Okay? All right, here we go. This created a shiver group of sharks that shadowed ships from Africa to the Americas. This created a shiver group, establishing new feeding patterns along these established maritime routes. So they knew when it was dinner time. Behavioral adaptation. Sharks were frequently observed surrounding slave ships, with crews noting them from the coast of Africa across to the Caribbean. Middle passage habit. Because hundreds of ships traveled the same route annually, sharks began to synchronize their feeding, associating these specific vessels with a consistent, abundant food source. They were like, there's the taco truck. Follow the taco truck. Follow the human truck. Impact on ecology. This sustained interaction for over 400 years meant that sharks, particularly in the Black Atlantic, adapted their feeding to the inhuman conditions of the trade, turning the migratory routes into feeding grounds. Historical documentation, ship logs, and diaries confirm that sharks were often seen following the ships, particularly during calm weather and when bodies were disposed of. Man. Some historians suggest the term shark itself gained prominence in the English language during the period, possibly adapted by sailors from this context. So, these sharks knew when it was time to get some food. And then that's just the beginning of your plight, you know. Then you get to America, and then you know the conditions get probably 50,000 times worse, because you either whooped, killed, family separated, told that you're gonna take a new name, you can't speak your native tongue, you can't speak your language no more, you gotta work 12-hour days, you gotta raise these people's babies, you gotta clean their house, you gotta do their dishes, you gotta feed their animals, you know, pick their crops, build their houses, build their barns, build their sheds, build their cities. And we don't get really anything in this country to show for it, man. All the stuff that we done put up with and still stood tall through it all, you know, stood tall and firm and still turned the other cheek. We turn the other cheek like Jesus when it come to you, you know, and the systematic, you know, system you built from back 400 years ago, that generational wealth was passed down to their children, their aunties, their uncles, and built a whole timeline for them to gain power and prestige and prominence. And the whole time, our generational wealth was built to further us down the ladder, to trodden us down, to beat us down, to make us not even think that we're even worth anything. You know what I'm saying? A systemic brainwash of a whole people. You know, this is what the transatlantic slave trade created, was a thinking of a people that believe they're not good enough, that we're not good enough for your society. We're not good enough for your rules. We're not good enough to look good in the same suit that you put on, that we put on. You say we don't look as good as you in it. It's never good enough in this country. I think people are tired of it. I'm tired of it. You know. I try to, try to teach my friends and family, we got to protect ourselves in this day and age. It ain't a safe America no more. America doesn't feel safe like when I was growing up. When I was growing up, me and my friends, hey, my mom would tell me that this how you know it's time to go home. When the street light come on, that mean you come home. We were running out and playing all football, doing all kind of stuff. And it felt safe. It felt like I was with my friends and the world was our oyster. Running around, having fun as a kid, playing basketball, playing sports, outside, talking to girls, having a great time. These kids don't do that these days. They on their phones and in the house, which is probably a good thing they in the house. But, you got to get out there and enjoy that nature too, So families start making time and take a nature trip with your family, But yeah, man, we living in dangerous times out here, man. The transatlantic slave trade, they took most of them people that went to South America were slaves as well. I mean, this whole America's populated, and a lot of the slaves and indigenous people that were here, the Indians, indigenous people, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Peruvians, the Argentinians, the people that were here before Spain and all them came and intermingled with them and brought slaves with them too, and them slaves intermingled with those people as well, and you have a lot of descendants down in South America from the transatlantic slave trade. So yeah, that's probably another reason, they want to shut the border down, because they don't want no more infestation of this black culture, of this black skin tone coming into America no more, because by 2050 we're all going to look alike anyway. Everybody's going to be mixed with something. We're not just one race anymore, or we're not just individual races no more. We're starting to become one race, and maybe that's a good thing in the long run. But also remember, when you mix with other races and stuff, you get the DNA from those people that are passed down. I believe in DNA, you pass down certain generational traits. If your parents were alcoholics, it's most likely that you'll be an alcoholic. If they were cannibals, it's most likely you want to eat human meat. I don't know, but it's passed down certain traits. So you need to be careful who you intermingling with, my opinion. But yeah, man, that concludes our day today. First part 1 of the transatlantic slave trade. There's going to be a part 2, probably a part 3, because I got a couple things that I want to talk about that happened at these colonies where they would bring the black people to. Those horrible conditions, just horrible atrocities happened in these colonies. And we're going to be bringing that story to you on the next episode. Well, probably not the next episode, but it'll definitely be a part 2 down the road. We got a lot of shows coming. We got the NaNTV behind the scenes. We got NaNTV, Nan Politically Correct coming. We got a lot of stuff in the works, man. Red Tex is about to drop his album soon. I got a couple projects dropping. Code Red's gonna be dropping. Gravity's working. We in here, man. Keep your circle small so everybody can help pick them up when someone fall. You know what I mean? We stay, we stay within our family elements, But yeah, man, everybody stay tuned. NaNTV, we're gonna keep bringing you the real from the coldest place on earth and telling you the stories that matter and that they don't teach you in school, or that they want you to forget about and try to tell you it's not important. It is important, because everybody needs to be aware of history. You know why history is important? So that you don't repeat it. Because if I don't remember, getting on a bike and falling off the bike, I won't know how to ride the bike today. So you got to learn from your mistakes. You got to learn from the past history of certain things that we don't need to continue for the future. So yeah, everybody stay tuned. We're going to keep dropping this heat on y'all. NaNTV, you know what it is, baby.
The transatlantic slave trade had a devastating impact on African societies. From the 16th to the 19th century, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and sold into slavery in the Americas. This trade not only led to loss of population and culture, but also disrupted the fabric of African society, altering its political, economic, and social structures. One of the most significant ways in which the transatlantic slave trade impacted African societies was through the loss of population. It is estimated that between 10 and 15 million Africans were taken from their homes in West and Central Africa and transported across the Atlantic. This mass trafficking of people had a ripple effect on the continent, with many communities losing a large proportion of their working-age population, resulting in serious economic and social consequences. The slave trade also disrupted the political structures of African societies. Many African societies were organized into kingdoms and empires, with a hierarchical system of governance. However, the slave trade led to the destabilization of these societies. The demand for slaves led to conflicts between neighboring communities as they sought to capture and sell their enemies into slavery. These conflicts often weakened local institutions of governance and led to an increase in stateless societies. The slave trade also contributed to the rise of new political actors, like military elites, who emerged as intermediaries in the trade and used their newfound wealth to challenge traditional political structures. The economic impact of the slave trade was perhaps the most significant. Africa was not only the starting point of the slave trade, but it was also a major supplier of raw materials, like gold and ivory, used to purchase slaves from African traders. The demand for slaves resulted in the growth of a new industry that was geared towards producing and trading in slaves. The slave trade also diverted human resources and investment away from other sectors of the economy, like agriculture, leading to a decline in food production and economic growth. It had a profound impact on the development of African societies and contributed to their underdevelopment. The social impact of the slave trade was perhaps the most significant. The slave trade not only led to the separation of families but also to the breakdown of social structures. The social fabric of African societies was disrupted as people were torn away from their homes, and communities were uprooted. The slave trade also led to the loss of cultural heritage, as many slaves were stripped of their traditional beliefs, customs, and practices. In the Americas, many Africans were forced to adopt the language, religion, and culture of their slave masters, further distancing them from their African identities. The impact of the transatlantic slave trade on African societies was not limited to the period of the slave trade itself. Even after the abolition of slavery in the Americas, African societies continued to be affected by its legacy. The slave trade had created a new social hierarchy in many African societies, with some communities, like the Akan of Ghana, benefiting from their involvement in the trade. However, this new hierarchy was based on wealth and power rather than social status, and it continued to shape African society long after the abolition of slavery. Additionally, many African societies were left with a legacy of trauma and psychological scars caused by the intergenerational trauma inflicted by the slave trade. In conclusion, the transatlantic slave trade had a profound impact on African societies. It was a period of disruption, loss, and traumatic experiences that shaped the continent's history, and its legacy continues to shape African societies today. The slave trade led to the loss of population, the breakdown of social structures, the destabilization of political institutions, and the diversion of resources away from other sectors of the economy, contributing to the underdevelopment of African societies. Despite the traumatic experiences, however, many African societies have shown remarkable resilience and have found ways to rebuild, and their unique cultures thrive today, despite the attempts of the slave trade to strip them of their heritage. It is important to recognize the impact of the slave trade, to acknowledge the trauma and loss it caused, and to work towards a better future for all Africans.